We have a lot to do, so I don't want to waste any time. My name is Jen Dolan, and I'm the program manager for the Rudd Adoption Research Program. And I am honored and so happy to be standing here before you. We spent so much time planning for the conference that it seems almost unreal that we're all here together. So thank you all so much for coming. Quite a few months ago, I had someone in my office, and when I told her that Ann Maston was going to be the keynote speaker, she literally stood up and started jumping up and down because she was so excited. I have to say, it's just warmed my heart to see such joy in an adult. So thank you, Ann, so much for being here with us today. Last year, after the conference, we read through the evaluations like we do every year, and we noticed a theme. And one of the themes was, where was the voice of those who are adopted? So we heard that, and that was one of the reasons that we decided to have this panel of adopted adults today. So thank you all for your feedback. All of our panel presenters are adopted, and they each work and/or have engaged in academic work in the field of adoption. The panel is meant to be a continuation of Ann's keynote on resilience, and therefore each of the presenters will weave into their talk the theme of resilience as they discuss the intersectionality of their personal lives with their professional lives as it relates to adoption. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in the order in which they will present. And since they will be talking about themselves, I'm going to keep my formal introductions brief. Next to Ann, first we have Judith Eckerle. She is an assistant professor of pediatrics in the Division of Global Pediatrics and is the director of the Adoption Medicine Program at the University of Minnesota. She currently sees domestic and internationally adopted children in the adoption clinic, as well as the Fetal Substances Exposures Clinic. Next we have Quade Yusong French, who is a postdoctoral clinical fellow at the Counseling and Psychological Services at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And as Hal mentioned earlier, he received his Ph.D. from UMass Amherst, where he studied the impact of social context as adoptive identity formation. He is also one of the founding organizers of the Adoption Mentoring Partnership Program, which you can all hear about later on this afternoon at one of our breakout sessions. And finally, we have Astrid Castro, who is currently the executive director and co-founder of Adoption Mosaic, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to connect, honor, and serve the adoption community through innovative education, practices, and support services. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
So I'm Judy Eckerle. Thank you so much for having me here. It really is an honor to be here. I'm going to stand up and talk from here because I'm more comfortable with that, and I wanted to show you a couple slides today. Panels are always a difficult thing because it's wonderful to have the voice of the adoptee, but I think what makes this panel really unique is that not only are we adopted people, but we all have professional backgrounds and professional experiences. So I'm going to talk more in a breakout session later on today about more of my professional work, and actually that's much easier for me to speak about because it's something that I do on an everyday basis. This is much more personal and difficult, but I'm more than happy to share my story with you if it helps you to understand kind of from another perspective. We, as professionals, I think we talk a lot about evidence-based medicine, and the bigger the number in the study, the better. So an N of 1, or a single person's personal study, sometimes can be difficult to interpret. But again, I think that all of our stories are also interpreted by us through the lens of a professional as well. And so hopefully you're going to get a well-rounded picture of kind of where we're coming from today. So this was my referral picture to my parents. And as an adoption professional and someone who speaks to parents every day about photos of their prospective children, the referral information that they get, my mom always says to me, "We got this," and she said, "You know what else we got? nothing. We knew you were a female and what age you were. We didn't have any medical background. We kind of just took a big leap of faith. And I think that that's what used to be the case for a lot of parents and families, is that they got the information and that was meant to be their child. These days, things are getting a lot more complicated, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but I'll just go kind of through my own experiences. When I heard the keynote speaker today, and in looking at some of her work before I got here, I was really interested to look at things from a different lens, because as a medical doctor, again, I think we all have a little bit of different perspectives on adoption, but I drew on some of those themes that she spoke about in order to give you a picture of kind of where I've come from. So this was a couple months after I'd arrived in my adoptive home. I think things were going pretty well. I was a chubby, happy baby, and I was adopted into a larger family of, I call this my Where's Waldo photo, because you can find me, Judy's somewhere in here. But this was one of our family reunions, and I was adopted into a family in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and my family had 2 biological children. When I came along, had a third child, or a fourth child, after I was in the family, and this is some of my extended family. So you can see, there's some interesting questions that I always went through growing up, being the only adopted child in a larger family of children. But again, things are going pretty well. I think my little brother is hilarious in this photo because he was having a bad day, I think. But the rest of us were having a pretty good day. And this was pretty typical. My mom kind of did that thing where we all got dressed alike, and we all kind of went the same places and did the same things. And yet, growing up, you don't know how your parents are doing, good, bad, not so good. Sometimes you don't know. As a professional now, I look back at some of the things that my parents did that were actually very progressive for the 1970s and the 1980s. I was one of the kids, but my parents always were very clear with me about being adopted. We talked about Korea. My parents had lived in Korea actually before they had any children, which gave them an interesting perspective because they had a hanbok that my mom would wear, and I would wear my hanbok. She had things from Korea that she would tell me about, and we would do things together, language classes. We would do things that would bring the culture closer to me at that time. So it was never the color blindness. There was never, kind of those concepts of, oh, you're not adopted. It was always very clear that I was adopted, and that was incorporated in our family. People who know me will know that this is fairly fitting. My brother, this photo, we have like 3 of those, and in one year my brother's a Viking and I'm a princess. And the next year my brother's a cowboy and I'm a princess. And then the next year my brother is a Minnesota Twins baseball player and I'm a princess. So this is kind of how we grew up. This is one of my favorite photos from growing up. And again, I think that this highlights some of the things when you talk about resilience and culture. My family was very open and honest about the culture and bringing it to me when I was, thinking about it or asking about it. I've had some really great conversations actually just in the last day about culture and family, because to be honest with you, I was pretty uninterested in Korea for the most part. I was pretty uninterested in my adoption for most of my life. But my family definitely made it available to me and made it something that they were open to talking about and brought a lot of things to me in case I was interested, which I really wasn't at the time. But I'm glad that they did it in looking back in hindsight. So then, the theme of this conference is transitions to adulthood and resilience and young adulthood. Just briefly, this is my favorite place on earth now, and this is a section in Seoul, Korea, called Myeongdong, where all of the kind of college girls will go and shop and hang out. It always looks like this. This is like 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and this is how it always looks. But I love it because, like I said, I was very uninterested in my adoption until my parents gave me a trip to Korea as my graduation present from college. And for me, it could have been Kenya or England. It was a trip, but it really did change my perspective at that point and kind of launched me on my journey of who I was as an adopted person. Relationships, I know Ann Maston spoke about relationships. This is my husband and my engagement photo from a couple years ago. And I would say that, there have been a lot of factors that have increased my ability to have good relationships, including my family background. But the road hasn't always been smooth, and as young adults go, going to Korea for the first time, one of the things that I saw around me on multiple adoptee trips and being with young adults during that time is that relationships were sometimes tricky for people, and especially once that they were experiencing kind of that new identity of who they were in the context of being an adopted person, things got a little complicated. Which brings me to now, how does this intersect with my professional life? Well, I think that for myself at least, I am a pediatrician, and I wear a number of hats for the university, but I also work in the emergency room. And I would say that I'm a really good emergency room doctor. But that's from learning from books, but mainly that's from seeing kids and my experiences of actually seeing children and helping them when things come up. I think when you're studying or learning about anything, you become a better expert when you've actually lived or experienced things instead of just reading about it in papers or in literature. If you've lived it and experienced it, I feel like that enriches your experience. I don't think that you have to have had those things in order to be an expert, but I feel like my experiences growing up as an adopted person, my experiences as an adopted person then, on that journey to my identity with other young adults, seeing what they went through, talking to them, experiencing those things really enriched my ability now to take care of adopted children. So this is me in an orphanage looking after a child who has some special needs. And most of my job these days at the adoption medicine clinic is seeing children who have pretty clearly identified special needs or have special needs that need to be identified. And that is what I love. My personal intersection with my professional life is really that I have a passion for these kids and for these families to help them become healthy. And I do have permission to use these photos from the families, but this is one of my favorite children of all time. He was in a foster home in Korea and had some pretty clear special needs that nobody could really figure out what was really going on with him. So I met him and we did a number of diagnostic tests. We did come up with his diagnosis, which was actually very serious. But the fact that we were able to identify this for the family, I was able to speak to the family about what that would really mean for him later on. They felt very comfortable proceeding with that adoption despite the fact that he will have some pretty major medical issues that he'll need to deal with in his lifetime. And that's him now in his adoptive home. His older brother taught him how to do a model face. So that's his, that's his version of that. But I love these photos because we really went from, not having a permanent family and having unidentified medical special needs to really being in a family and really being successful in that family. So that's really my goal at the adoption medicine program, is to help create healthy families. Every time I hear talk on resilience and transition to early adulthood and some of the issues that children, adopted or not, but children from early adversity have experienced, I always want to kind of get my hands on them from a medical perspective, because I think that, if you have a kid with a broken leg, you can give them crutches, you can cast it, you can do all sorts of things, but if you don't actually fix that broken leg, you're going to expect them to walk with crutches the rest of their life. As a medical person, I want to get in there when they're young so that I can fix or try to help or make better some of those things that might have been affected by the early adversity or the things that they experienced in early life, so that we don't just have to give them crutches. If we can fix it early on from a very comprehensive team approach that includes the medical part of it, that is my goal as a professional, is to help these children and these families to be successful. So that's how my personal and professional have intersected, and I'll hand it off to Quade. Thank you so much.
Hello. So my name is Quade Yusong French. I'll give you a little bit of background so you know where everything that I'm saying is coming from. I was transracially adopted at the age of 10 months from South Korea into a Euro-American family in Southern California. And I grew up in the Valley, if you're familiar with the area, so it's a largely white area. There's a Latino mix too. And that really was formative in terms of my own identity development around adoption, but then in particular around racial identity development and cultural identity development. And it was later through my own professional training and clinical work that those started to become fleshed out for me when I had more opportunity to connect with others around their experiences. So that's some background for you. When I was listening to Anne's talk, I just want to share some of the things that I wrote down that stood out for me. And it was an idea that individual resilience is dependent on the resiliency of associated systems. Also that resilience is not a trait, but then given that I'm coming not only from a research background, but a clinical perspective as well, I was thinking, well, early experiences are formative in shaping how we view ourselves in the world around us. So if resiliency is not a trait inborn, what does that mean, though, in terms of psychological understandings of the world and the self? And then also this idea of resiliency being measured across competence in developmental tasks, which in the resiliency literature, it's acknowledged that those are very socially contrived and that they can vary across the different social groups that have these expectations. So what role does that play in how we're assessing resilience for people? And then finally, at the very end, you mentioned the intersection or the growing intersection between not only individual resilience research and literature, but family resilience work, which I'm glad to hear is happening because, especially in adoption, so much of the literature and writing about the individual talks about the black box that happened before the adoptive person was placed. But then I was thinking, well, so what about the unknowns of the adoptive family system? And what role does that have on shaping how the adopted person in that system comes to understand themselves and how we think about resiliency? So I'll give some background also about my clinical views and orientation theoretically, because that's also going to help you understand what I'm thinking about. So I draw a lot on multidimensional identity perspectives. I draw a lot on multicultural views and systemic perspectives as well. And so that should give you a sense of why my interests are where they are. I focus a lot on the roles of power and prejudice that happen in people's lives across different dimensions of their identities. And this comes out a lot in the clinical work that I do with young adults in college, thinking about the different factors that contribute to their ability to function in a university setting when, for example, their parent is a seasonal worker in the fields in California and what that does, and they don't have access to insurance, or they're the first generation in their family to go to school. So what are these other things that are at play as well? Okay, so with that, let's see. Okay, so with all of that and the clinical work as well, I started to think in preparation for this panel about the role of expectations. Not just expectations that we as professionals have about adopted individuals, but what expectations the adopted individual has about themselves, how they form those expectations, what expectations the adopted parents have about their adopted child and of themselves as parents and people, and what society expects of that whole system. And so what I'll do is I'll just give you just some thoughts that I had and reflections about expectations across those different dimensions. Okay, notes. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start broad to consider the social context that this discussion is happening in. So, you know, outside of this conference, all of us are very adoption-minded and that sort of thing, but this is a select group. I mean, if you think about the understanding of adoption across just the United States, but then globally, perspectives vary greatly. And there's a lot of stigma. It's there. Adoption stigma is a huge part of what adopted individuals will face going out into the world, and adopted parents as well. There's a lot of writing around stigma and understanding that in many people's views, adoption is the second best method of family formation, second to biological childbirth. And so the system, the adopted parents and family and the adopted person are viewed in that way. When you think about the adopted parents, a lot of the perspectives come out of this idea of, oh, well, there's some infertility involved, or why couldn't you have your biological children, so then you chose adoption. Or there's the perspective of, oh, how great is that you're taking this child in? This is nobility sort of rescue component as well. For the adopted individuals, there's the sense of, okay, well, someone didn't want you, right? There's some concepts of damage and abandonment that really pervade throughout that person's life. And then, of course, part of the system are birth parents as well. And so you have all sorts of stigma, not just around the choice to place that child for adoption, but you're thinking about birth parents often coming from disadvantaged situations. There are people in social minority groups, low SES, and all these things. So there's a lot of, all of those views around stigma and beliefs about these people that pervade how adopted individuals think about themselves and what resiliency looks like, I think. Talk about microaggressions and everything that we deal with, and you tell someone that you're adopted, and it's like, oh, dude, I'm sorry about that. Or they'll talk to you about your real parents or what your real parents are or not. And these are common things that you see, so maybe it's there. I'm just saying, oh, let's think about these too. And then I think it's important to also think about what's going on in the United States and across the world, just globally, in terms of, oh man, the turmoil around race, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, everything, because adoption is one part of what we're, as adopted individuals, dealing with and having to understand and integrate into our sense of self. So it's important to think about that context as well, particularly because a lot of, at least international adoptions, are adoptions of people of color by white families. So what does that do? So, there are multiple identities that have to be considered. See, so that was 2. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to parents a little bit and the adoptive family system. Where's 3? Okay. So, if I think about the adopted parents, one of the things that you had was that sort of generational competencies can sort of help along down the line, and that if you have a system that's functioning well, that can support better functioning, and then hopefully that better functioning individual or system can then support a better functioning system down the line. And I was thinking about adopted parents in terms of their own backgrounds and senses of self, and at least in international, again, because that's the world that I'm in mostly. You have a largely white, upper middle class parents adopting people of color from disadvantaged countries. So given that, and given let's focus on adopted parents for a minute, these are some ideas and things that have come up in clinical work as well. That if you think about the role that the attitude of blood ties dominating and being important for validating families, these are the ideas and beliefs that adopted parents in the United States were exposed to their whole lives too. You can't extricate that from their understanding. Man, 2 minutes, okay. And so just as there are these pressures to have a biological family system, you have to think about what that means for the adopted parents if they can't do that for whatever reason, right? So it's important to think about motivations that they have in adopting. And given the understanding of biological ties being supreme in the US at least, what that means in terms of pressure on the adopted parent to prove that the adoptive family system works, that it's just as good as, and in thinking about their pressures on themselves to be good parents, what that means in terms of their interactions with the adopted child and pressures that they may place on that person or expectations as well. So motivation, I think, is key to think about. I'm paraphrasing because I have 2 minutes, less now. Oh, thanks. So then in that, now that I have more time, I think it's important to think about the adoptive family system because the adoptive parents are the ones largely shaping that system, at least in the household. And so it's widely assumed that the adoptive family system is better than the environment that that child came out of. And across many dimensions of assessment that can be looked at, it is. I mean, you're talking about a more privileged, better resourced social system that the person is being placed into. But what about emotional expressivity and regulation of emotions and ability to communicate and those sorts of things? What about parent attitudes that may be subconsciously sort of put out there in their verbal and nonverbal communications to the child about what they think that person should or should not be, what they should or shouldn't be? And how does that play a role in terms of the messages that the person then, the adopted person then internalizes? And all that, I think, can come out of just looking at, well, what pressure does a parent feel to be a good parent? And what does that look like? And so, okay, let's shift our attention then to the adopted individual, given that we've talked about this context that they're in, just briefly. And so, let's see, number 4, where are you at? Okay, we know what role internalization of pressures and expectations can do. There's research on stereotype threat around race and gender and all those sorts of things. But what do we do then if the risk factor is the fact that we have an adoptive status, at least in the United States. People are automatically going to assume less of us, or that we have struggles that we need to overcome. So we're already in a position where we need to fight against those. So we're already starting out a little behind, I think. And in that, how are we integrating a sense of competency and developing a sense of ability and worth, given that these are some messages that are given to us? And right, there's, of course, the flip side is positive communication with families and parents and all that stuff, but these are things that the adopted individual will run into when they go out into the community and move beyond the system or beyond conferences or communities like this. So what does that do? And then in addition to this idea around internalizing everything about adoption, think about the other dimensions of that person too. If it's a person of color, what are they thinking about things that are going on in Ferguson and everything, and all the racial turmoil that's happening in the United States? Where does that fit in? What happens about sexual identity and gender identity and socioeconomic status in class, and the challenges of young adulthood in terms of getting a job? So starting to think more about expectations and pressure in terms of resiliency, looking at the adopted person from a multidimensional perspective as well, because we can have a singular focus as adoption researchers sometimes. And then also finally, the pressure placed on adopted individuals around, well, what are you going to do with what you got, right? So you have access to all these things now, so you got to do something. And whether that message is explicitly given or not, it's there, I think, for many people. For some it's not, but I think that is too. And then you think about how this person then is going to function, and the pressure that they feel going to college or not, whether they get a job and what that job is, internalizing all these pressures from the system that they've been experiencing. Okay, I'm going to totally wrap up now, because I'm probably well over 2 minutes. So what does that mean then? You know, we know that context plays a role, family attitudes play a role. What does that mean, though, in terms of moving forward and thinking about your work with young adults who are adopted? Well, I think from clinical work and from research, what's come out is just that idea of autonomy that you had on one of your slides. And in many ways, it's the ability of that young adult at that age to sort of reclaim and recraft that adoption narrative, this story that's been applied to them, that's been handed down from their parents and by the agencies and all that. It's time for the adopted individual to be able to say, what does this mean for me? What do all these intersecting aspects of self, race and culture and religion and identity and adoption mean for me? And so anything that you all can do, and we all can do, to help understand that and promote that within the system and in your clinical work or research with the adopted individuals, I think could be really helpful in terms of promoting resiliency from within and helping the adopted individual to think about themselves on their terms and what that means. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for having me. So I have to say, on Monday, I think it was, we had our phone conference, all of us, to talk about this panel and what we were going to do. And I've been on so many panels over my lifetime. I was kind of, standing my ground and saying, you know what, I'm kind of done talking about my personal story. I have talked about my personal story so much and put it out there for display and let other people dissect it and have opinions about it, and I'm done with that. I'm an adoption professional. I want to be seen as an adoption professional. I want to be respected as an adoption professional. And it's really important for me that I might say a thing or two about my personal story, but really I'm going to focus on my professional aspect. All right, scratch all of that, okay? And then Anne did her presentation. And it's like, oh, shit. Now I got to process some stuff. The thing is that, and sorry, there's plenty of therapists. I figured I'd use all of you guys to help me process this. No, there's this aspect where, as we all go off into the corners of our regions of the world, we don't really have the opportunity to have such a academic, fulfilled, rich conversation. And so not very often do I have the opportunity until I'm around my colleagues and many of you, friends, other adult adoptees who are also professionals, adoptive parents who have chosen this work as their life work. Not very often do I, in my corner of Portland in my world, do I get this opportunity to really be engaged and have some of those buttons pushed that I haven't had pushed in my Portland world, if you will. So I am going to tell you a little bit more than I had expected about my personal experience. And I'm wondering how much of this, my story, Hal actually knows, and if this is why he invited me to this panel. So I was adopted when I was 4.5 years old. My sister, my biological sister, she was 6. We came to the United States together. We were adopted into a family here in the United States, actually here in Massachusetts. And we had the Caucasian family. They weren't able to have children, had decided after many, many years of trying to have children that they were going to adopt. And they adopted 2 children from Colombia and a sibling group. They said that they knew that they wanted to have more than 1 kid, so they decided to go ahead and just keep a sibling group together. They were older because they had been trying for so many years, so they decided to not have infants. That wasn't important. And so my sister and I were raised in Massachusetts, East Coast, Atlanta. We moved about every 5 years outside of Portland, Maine, and in all white rural areas. And my parents had 0 access to 0 resources around adoption. It was in the 70s that they adopted the 2 of us. My sister and I came with 0 English, and my parents, surprise, surprise, didn't speak a word of Spanish. We were adopted from Colombia, I don't think I said that. And so our first language and our only language was Spanish at the time. And so one of the things, Anne, that really came up for me was this idea of resilience versus assimilation. And what that really means to, is it resilience or is it the child adapting to survive? And I, being 4.5, and we also know that so much of the developmental years had already happened, and my sister was 6. For us to be the adults in the situation of having the expectation that we would abandon completely everything we knew is disturbing, is very disturbing. And I feel that we know enough about adoption today to make sure that those things don't happen anymore. And Judy and I had a great conversation last night about language. And I have this idea, and maybe I live in a fantasy world, but I have this idea that if we ask adoptive parents, prospective adoptive parents, so before they're placed with children internationally, if we ask them the question, is it essential to raise your child bilingual if they live in a different country, if they were born in a different country? Essential. And when I say the word essential, I mean like brushing your teeth essential. In this country, we don't give children the opportunity to say, you want to brush your teeth tonight or not, right? We say it's essential, you have to brush your teeth. So when I say that to parents, prospective adoptive parents, and I know I'm pushing some buttons here, and some of you might push back, which is great, I love that, that if we're saying to adoptive parents, it's essential for the child to be bilingual in whatever language, when we ask them that question, we see, and I do a workshop on that, we see parents stand in a quadrant of the room where they say, no, the word essential really threw me off. It's not essential, but it's important. I'd like to introduce at least the sound. I'd like to introduce it enough so that they know their colors and their numbers and so forth. And so when they choose, if they choose to learn the language, they will. Well, we also know how many kids are going to choose to learn a language at the age of 15, at the age of 12, at the age of 10, and language acquisition, we cannot become fluent in a language, completely fluent in a language unless we learn it or keep it or retain it as a child, right? So as a result, children they lose their language or they never had it and they never have really the opportunity to really learn that language. And so then when I say to them, these same parents, would you stand in a different place in the room that you would disagree, strongly disagree? Would you stand in a different place in the room if you knew that your child was going to want to return back to their country? If you knew that you could wave your magic wand and you knew that they were going to have a relationship with their birth parents and that they were going to meet their birth parents, almost hands down, every single person moves to a different place in the room. And they say, well, if I knew they were going to have a relationship with their birth family, I absolutely would say it's essential. And so this shift happens in the way they think about it. And we were talking about whether you force kids to learn a language or not and so forth. And so Judy and I had a really great conversation about that. Anyway, so my sister and I completely lost. We lost our language. We went through the assimilation process. We immigrated into this country. We didn't access or have any services as immigrants into this country because when you're adopted, you don't immigrate. You just become adopted. It's one of those phenomenons when about 5 years ago, a man that was from China said, oh, so how old, he was born and raised in China, lives now in the United States. He said, how old were you when you immigrated into this country? First time I'd ever heard that. And I said, oh, no, I didn't immigrate into this country, I was adopted. And he looked at me and he said, no, you immigrated into this country, absolutely. And it dawned on me that there's a lot of services for children and families that immigrate into this country, a lot of expectations that they won't learn the language immediately, expectations that they will need services and so forth. And we don't offer that to the adoptive family. We just kind of assume that they will all figure it out. But the person who really is responsible for figuring it out is the child, I believe, oftentimes. It's the child who is assimilating to the new culture and the new language and so forth. So I grew up pretty angry, pretty upset in my life. I was between the ages of 13 and 18. I didn't know how to read. I didn't learn how to read until I was 14. I was dyslexic. Whether that trumps whatever, it definitely was a huge aspect in my ability to be successful. And that was another thing that we talked about, like the definition of success for a child who had all of these special needs, if you will. Success, I think, looked very different than how we westernize success and talk about that. And so transitioning into adulthood, there was one thing that happened in my life. At the age of 18, I was asked to be on a panel for the first time ever. I had gone and volunteered. I don't even know why. I went, actually, Rocky Mountain Adoption Exchange. I went and volunteered, and I decided that I was just going to go and fill some things out and help them file things and so forth, and volunteer maybe one day a week. And at one point, I was telling somebody about my story, and they said, would you sit on a panel for prospective adopted parents? Your story is amazing. And I said, yeah, sure, I don't care. And I sat on a panel, and I just basically, I was 18, and I had just kind of was in the process of kind of getting out of some really hard times in my life. And I sat on this panel, and I told way too much of my personal story. And we all do that, right? It's crazy. So I told way too much of my personal story, but everybody in the audience was like sitting on the edge of their seat. And afterwards, for the first time in my life, people were coming up to me and thanking me. And thanking me for sharing, thanking me for sharing my story so they could be better parents if they chose to adopt. And it was that moment that I was actually getting praise for the first time, doing something that was legal and successful, and that my parents could brag about. This was like the first thing they could brag about that Astrid did. So I found myself really gravitating towards this need to talk about my story. And I didn't realize I was going to be an adoption professional at the time. I just was like signing up for every panel. And that's an interesting phenomenon because right now, as the executive director of Adoption Mosaic, we do panels all the time. And the adult adoptees that want to serve Adoption Mosaic are asking all the time, when's your next panel? I want to be on a panel, and realizing how therapeutic that is, but also realizing what a setup it potentially is for those young people to be telling their story and not having maybe a cushion to be able to realize there's boundaries also. So sitting on the panel and feeling successful in something positive was definitely my launch into adulthood. It was definitely my, the thing that empowered me to feel like there was something more to this world of adoption that I could give back. And then I thought I was going to work for an adoption agency and help place babies for adoption. There was really no other opportunity in the field of adoption. I was sure that I was going to become a social worker and do that. I decided after working and doing several internships at several different adoption agencies that was definitely not what I wanted to do. I realized there was a huge gap in services and that individuals' perspective, specifically when we first started the organization, the prospective adoptive parents were not making informed decisions around their adoption. They were making decisions around their adoption through the education of the placement system, and that I felt like there was a problem with that. The only place families were getting their education and support was from their placement agency. And there was no place that they could go and have some really hard conversations about, is transracial adoption right for us? Is adoption right for us? Is special needs adoption? Is sibling? What is the lifelong journey, if you will, of adoption actually look like? Because we spend so much time talking about the 0 to 18. I spent a lot of time talking about the 18 to 86, right? Because if we're talking about the 18 to 86, that's a lot more years. And we don't talk about that very often. We spend so much energy and so much time. And yet, I feel like we need more of a platform to ask hard questions and so people can make informed decisions around their adoption. So, there you have it. Thank you.
That literature strongly endorses what Astrid has said about language. Not only that language can be viewed as a personal protective factor, preserving the language of origin, but also that increasingly the case is being made for preserving the language or languages of origin as a national treasure, that we need to preserve these resources coming in. In general, in the refugee literature as well, it's also the case that whether or not the language is preserved of origin, that the capacity to acquire another language when you move into a new culture is a very important protective factor in that context. And it's important for us to keep in mind that some protective factors work in a particular situation. But if you are we found this Cambodian war survivors that moved. They were in refugee camps in Thailand, had survived Pol Pot, and they were moved, a lot of them were moved into Minnesota. And being able to pick up English, many of them didn't speak a word of English either. And first of all, it's harder when you're a teenager than when you're 4 or 2 months old. And, the young people who picked up English readily had a huge advantage in terms of the school climate. The other thing I wanted to reflect on from all of what you had to say is that I think it's very important for us to always keep in mind that the way we think about positive adaptation, what are our criteria for that? How do we define that? That's a judgment call. It's always in context, and I think it gets to be a very interesting discussion when you have multicultural situations. And whether you're talking about a family that immigrates together and then their children face the multiple worlds of, 2 different cultures, one culture at school, one at home, for example, and they have to learn how to navigate that. And some of the researchers like Selchuk Sirin talk about residing on the hyphen, that you're Khmer American or Colombian American or something like that, and learning how to do that. But it's also the case that this can happen within a family. If a young adult in Minnesota, if a young adult who grows up in an Indian reservation makes the decision to come to the University of Minnesota, there often are issues that come up within the family. At home, they can't stay too long because then their tribal peers and family members will begin to wonder, like, are you really still part of our group or not? So issues come up of navigating a culture within a family where somebody has chosen to go off into a different environment. I think that we should give you guys a chance to ask a question. So does anybody have a question for the panel? It's been a wonderful... Yes, do you want to come up to the microphone so we can hear you? Thank you.
Hi, I want to thank the panel for being here. It's great to hear your perspectives, and this is the first time I've actually had any opportunity to talk with adults, professionals who are also adopted. I'm an adoptive mom of a tween who is turning 11, and I'm a clinical social worker, and this is a little high for me. I've sort of read and heard a lot about the issue of loss and grief as sort of a continuing theme for people who are adopted throughout their lives, throughout various developmental stages. And I find as a parent and a social worker, I'm always sort of in between focusing on strength and resilience, but also not wanting to ignore or, miss the impact of adoption for my daughter. She's getting to an age where more of the feelings are underground, so I see it in behavior. My daughter was 3 months old when I adopted her from Armenia, and I'm Armenian. But I guess the question, is, there's a sense, there's this major bond that's severed for my daughter at a pre-verbal age. And that because of that, there's like a wiring that occurs at that age that is she's sort of built in this way. And we're trying in different ways to work with that. So she's a happy kid, she's an athlete, she's an artist, but she's also sort of hypervigilant, has control issues and anxiety. And without being too personal, I was wondering if you guys, since you've lived it, and I'm not an adopted person, I haven't, if you could speak to that a little bit and give suggestions for a parent. Thank you.
So that's a great question. I just have a couple of thoughts that I'll share on that. And as you were telling your story, two things came into mind, and one was the work of David Kirk, and he was talking a long time ago about the acceptance or rejection of difference and the role that that plays. So I think that's a fundamental question in adoption. And the second thing that I was thinking about was some work by Irving Leon around the loss of adoption as being a social construct. Because if you look at adoption or the raising of non-biologically related children in other families across cultural contexts, it's framed very differently. I mean, there's studies from the South Pacific around that and a bunch of different areas where we see that the way that adoption is framed culturally has a huge impact then on what that adopted person and the family and the system come to believe about themselves and their place in the world and what they mean relative to other non-adopted families. So those are just some things that I was thinking about as you were talking about in terms of advice. I mean, I'm just going back to the same thing around, communication, really. Communication and understanding that your tween daughter is a time where she's starting to think about what these things mean for her. So providing her with spaces and opportunities to think about what that dimension of adoption means in her life and how she's going to integrate it. But then also within the cultural context of your background, I mean, in terms of loss and hardship, that's woven throughout the Armenian culture with genocide and everything else like that. So where does that fit in and how does she bring that into her sense of self too?
Any other comments here?
So I'm probably going to start sounding like a broken record by the end of this day, but so we see many children, just like your daughter, in our clinic for evaluations. Was she adopted as an infant, or was she as an infant? So, and like myself, who was adopted at 5.5 months, I think the feeling used to be, oh, if they're adopted really young, they'll be fine. There's no problem. They're adopted at a day old, or we took custody from them from the hospital, so there's not going to be any, they're not going to have any loss or grief or any issues with that. And I think now, most of us in this room, I'm probably preaching to the choir, know that that's not always the case. But the other thing that I was going to say is that when I hear about kids who are hypervigilant, who have some anxiety or acting out, I will, oftentimes I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, so I work with a great adoption psychologist who will do a lot of the work, that Quade is talking about with the families to flesh out some of those issues. But we've shown pretty clearly that medically these kids often have iron deficiency, that iron deficiency can affect their brains, and that oftentimes they've never been checked by their primary care, or they've been screened and not tested, which is not the same thing. And we've missed their iron deficiency stage 1, stage 2 for 11 years, or however long it was. They're starting to do a lot of work with other vitamins like choline and vitamin D that's also never been checked. We see these kids with a lot of sensory processing issues, so they have auditory processing, or they're reactive to touch or to other things, and again, that has not been addressed, and so their anxiety levels are already here, so it doesn't take a very big bump for them to kind of hit the ceiling, and now behaviorally they're looking, out of control. So I would just advocate that, along with kind of the therapy and the therapeutic resources, that these kids also be screened for some of the more medically based issues that might not solve everything and the grief and the loss, but it might be exacerbating what you're seeing. So that's just.
I wanted to add one developmental comment, which is that I think one of the things that happens developmentally is that you don't adapt to something that happened just for now. I mean, as you continue to grow and develop, you readapt. I mean, humans are different from every other species because we can reflect, anticipate, and so, something that happened a long time ago, as we develop the cognitive capacity to think about it, it brings up new issues as we begin to understand what it means, think through. So, as you go through life, I would imagine you think through the adoption and what it means to you with all the changing experiences that you have going along and that you continue to revisit. Astrid.
Yeah, and I just see over and over again that children aren't really given the language so much to actually be able to speak about it in an informed way, speak about their emotions, so many of us who were adopted in the 70s that were given the opportunity to, you can talk about adoption whenever you want, whenever you're ready, we're here to listen, but there's nothing other than that, and so we're not really giving kids, we're kind of the lip service seems to be happening, but we're not really giving them the tools that they actually need to have that dialogue, to have that conversation. And also, I run a youth activity group, and in that group, we hear over and over that kids are saying, I get really tired when my mom is always talking about adoption, blah. And one day it dawned on me, like we're swinging the pendulum sometimes in the other direction, but it's not to say that we need to stop talking about it. It's what's happening is that the focal point is always 100% the child. It's never about the infertility of the parents. It's never about the community at large. It's never about something that's external to the child. No child wants to have the spotlight on them unless they're sitting on this panel and they're in their 40s. And so, it just gets old. And so we're hearing, at least in our groups, we're hearing kids say, gosh, mom and dad, they need to go to a group and talk about this stuff because I'm just done. And so, and I really think that speaks a lot to, we have swung the pendulum to the other direction, and we haven't really gotten it. We haven't really figured out an organic way to get kids to actually talk about and process this. Instead, we're pathologizing.
One thing that I'll add to that is around gender. I mean, in the United States, males are socialized not to talk about these things, but let alone adoption. We're not socialized to talk about how we feel, and sitting down across from someone and talking about the experiences that you have or the feelings that you have, that's totally scary and foreign. I mean, it goes against so much socialization that we've had. So it's thinking about, as you said, think about other ways to engage male adopted individuals, but then around adoption in general. And so if I think about things, it's like the adoption mentoring partnership and engaging in people in other ways where they can form a relationship that's not just about let's sit down and have all this feeling talk, but let's just go out and like let's do stuff and let's be normal together, and from there start that foundation of how to have a conversation later on.
Well, I think it's about that time for lunch, is my understanding. Pause. We're getting instructions. But I think this would be a good place to stop this conversation, so thank you very much to the panel.